So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to really walk you through this case from the beginning right until the end. I'm going to play every piece of video that we have. Sometimes you're going to see it more than once. What I'm about to show you may at times be repetitive of what the Colonel said. I'm doing that because I've watched these videos many, many times. I know this is the first time that some of you or the public may be seeing it, so it's important, I think, for us to go through this in painstaking fashion. Let me again begin by saying the lens through which we were analyzing this case at this point, having determined how the accident occurred, what did we learn, what can we find, what can we conclude about Officer Endres' driving? Whether or not he struck the stop sign and the stop sign struck Mr. Gonsalves, or whether he struck Mr. Gonsalves directly, does not alter that analysis. It's important to know that fact, but it does not end our inquiry. We have to ask ourselves whether or not Officer Endres' driving amounted to reckless driving, not negligent driving, reckless driving. So if we can, begin with our first slide. Look, I think it's really important to set the scene of what Providence Police was addressing on this day. And this is a broader question that I think we all have to grapple with, which is the state of play in Providence on October 18th of 2020. You know, it's not lost, I think, on anybody here out in the public that on that day there were hundreds of motorbikes traveling through the city. Not everybody, but many of those bikers were driving on both sides of the road. They weren't stopping at traffic signals, and many were not authorized to be driving on city streets in the first place. They didn't have a license plate, for example, when they were required to do so. The challenge for Providence under those circumstances, next slide please, the challenge for Providence under those circumstances is how to respond safely. Safely for the public, safely for the bikers, and safely for the police. So that's a real challenge, and I know from talking before this incident and after the incident to Providence, to the State Police, that is a challenge that we are not yet capable of meeting. And if I had recommendations as to how to do it, I'd offer them. But as I sit here today, I don't have them. But that's the state of play on October 18th of 2020. So what were the directives from the Providence Police Department to its members on that day? We asked this question. I asked this question a number of times. I wanted to know what were officers being told to do under these difficult circumstances. And the directives, as I've gleaned them, both from the top of the department down to the lowest supervisory level, if you will, from sergeants, was monitor them, follow them, pull them over if you can safely. Now you can only imagine what kind of challenge that presents to a police officer. When can you pull somebody over safely when they're riding 200 at a time? I don't know the answer to that. But what I can glean from this investigation is this, that on that day, looking at body cam footage from around the city, that officers were trying to pull people who were violating, bikers who were violating the traffic code or committing other violations at instances where they were stopped at an intersection or had become separated from the group. In those instances where they weren't moving in volume or moving at all, they were trying to make arrests. And I believe the numbers, it's in our report, there were about 7 arrests made that day around the city. Next slide, please. So at around 6 p.m., something called the Broad Street Detail becomes aware of a group of motorbikes at the Providence Water Supply Board parking lot. The Broad Street Detail is led by Sergeant Kurdis on that afternoon. There are a number of individuals, officers, including Officer Endres, assigned to that detail. Their job, as it is on any typical weekend day, is to monitor criminal activity in that neighborhood, be a presence, and if the motorbikes are out, try to do what they can to eliminate a public safety issue. Mr. Gonsalves was part of the group that was gathered at the Providence Water Supply parking lot. The scooter he was driving had no license plate. The Broad Street Detail begins to follow a group of bikers down Elmwood Avenue. Again, Mr. Gonsalves is part of that group. He actually becomes separated and begins trailing the larger group. According to officers who were in his close vicinity, had actually had interaction with him, and their statements will be released today. Their statements are characterized and described in our report, but the bottom line is Mr. Gonsalves was speaking to Officers Cabral. She was the driver, I believe, of that particular cruiser, her partner, as well as they drove along. He was communicating with them as he drove. Those two officers, those women officers, described him as driving into the oncoming lane at one point and possibly going through a red light, although he was not alone in that regard. That was something that was being done by bikers throughout the city. And as I said, Mr. Gonsalves ended up at some point trailing the pack of the other bikers. We can have the next slide, please. So Officer Endres and his cruiser, Mark Cruiser, and Officers Cabral and Caba and their cruiser attempt to pull Mr. Gonsalves over. And this occurs as Mr. Gonsalves, this happens as Mr. Gonsalves is heading southbound on Elmwood, crosses in front of the cruisers, crosses over the northbound lanes, and into what is the parking lane of Elmwood Avenue. As he does so, and we'll see it on the video we're going to show in a second, the cruisers of Officer Endres and Officers Cabral and Caba, who are together, as I pointed out, and a third unmarked white Providence police car also pulled to the side of the road. And to me, this is consistent with the Providence police marching orders on that day. If someone is separated from the group and appear to be pulling over, and potentially you can stop them and cite them safely, then you are permitted to do it. Next slide, please. All right, so if we can play this video. This video, before, yeah, if we can just hold it for a second. I just want to, if you can back it up and play from the beginning in a second. There are, I believe, 5 videos. The bottom line is every video that we have, you will have today. Again, you can access it from our website. This is what we describe as the Spooner Street video. This is taken by a civilian at the intersection of Spooner Street and Elmwood Avenue. This was posted on social media. The investigative team could not locate the person who actually took this video, but we do have it, and we're going to play it now. This shows the interaction that I just described a moment ago as the police officers follow Mr. Gonsalves as he pulls into that northbound parking lane on Elmwood Avenue. If you could roll that, please. Now again, what you see in that video is a group of bikes go up Elmwood Avenue southbound, Mark Cruiser trailing with the flashing lights on, following. You see Officers Endres and Caba and Cabral pull to the side. You see Mr. Gonsalves circle and head back down Elmwood Avenue. If we can play that again, please. All right, next slide, please. All right, now this is a video taken by someone that we describe as civilian number 6. This is taken at the same point, or of the same view, or the same event, if you will, but taken from across the street. It shows, again, the large group of bikers going southbound on Elmwood towards Cranston. It shows the Providence police cruiser with the lights on following, and then you see at the end Mr. Gonsalves and the other cruisers, I believe Officer Endres, and Officers Caba and Cabral as well. So if we can play that, please. All right, so again, that shows the group going by, the following Providence cruiser. You see the white unmarked Providence police car pulled to the left, and you see sort of the end of Mr. Gonsalves circling, making a hand gesture to the police officer, and then continuing southbound on Elmwood. If you'd show that again, please. So as Mr. Gonsalves goes down the street, Officer Endres and Officers Caba and Cabral follow. All right, so there's about 10 seconds or less between the time that following begins, that second following, if you will, and the crash. It's a very short period of time, and it's why you're going to see with these videos, we ultimately break them down into still shots. This is a critical fact, and we're going to spend some time on it. Officer Endres' radios box this guy in. So if we go to the next slide, please. Actually, to play this audio. So this is an audio. This audio is not from Officer Endres' body cam. This is actually from Providence transmission records. So you're going to see the video in a second, but this audio is not coming from that video.
Box this guy in.
And play it again, please.
Box this guy in.
All right, next slide. Okay, if you can play this. Okay, what you see here is obviously Officer Endres picking up his radio. And we've concluded, although it's not on that particular piece of video, because the way the body cams work, it doesn't record that audio going back that far. It shows the video, but not the audio. We've concluded, which I think is obvious, that that's the radio transmission that Officer Endres made. So we go to the next slide, please. So this is the area of the collision on Bissell Street and Elmwood Avenue. Next. Okay, so we looked really closely at that box this guy in radio call, what the reaction was from other officers, what it meant for our case. The first question we had to ask ourselves was, did anybody on Providence Police react to it? Because whether or not Officer Endres said it or not, whether he should have said it or not, is ultimately not relevant to what we were trying to analyze. What was relevant was whether or not Mr. Gonsalves was boxed in, whether anyone took an action in response to what Officer McParland said. So what you're going to see here in the video and the slides that follow is that Officer McParland is also coming down southbound ahead of Mr. Gonsalves and Officers Endres and Cabral and Caba. And he makes a right turn onto Bissell Street, makes a three-point turn, turns around, waits at that stop sign, the stop sign that plays a large role in this case. The group goes by, that we've already seen on the video. The trailing Providence cruiser goes by with the lights on. And at that point, Officer McParland pulls into the intersection to make a left northbound on Elmwood. The Cranston City line is not far down the street. He pulls into that intersection as determined by the Rhode Island State Police Collision Reconstruction Unit just before Officer Endres' radios box this guy in. Again, Officer McParland moves into the intersection. You can see on the video we're about to see that he brakes, and then he nearly stops, and then he proceeds forward as Mr. Gonsalves approaches. And Officer McParland continues to drive forward when he realizes that Mr. Gonsalves is going to go behind him. Now, what's really critical about this, for our analysis, was that Officer McParland moved and continued to move. So next slide, please. So we're going to show a bunch of videos here. This is the Elmwood Avenue, Bissell Street intersection. This is the Bissell Street video. This is the video, and again, we're focusing here not so much on the crash, but we're focusing here on what Officer McParland did, and whether anything he did was in response to the radio call, box this guy in. So this is a piece of that video. We're not showing the crash, we'll come back to that later. Here we are analyzing, this is the analysis we did, what was Officer McParland's reaction, if any, to that radio call by Officer Endres. If you can roll this, please. You can see the three-point turn here by Officer McParland. And there's a little hitch in this video. That is in the original as best we can tell. So that hesitation you see in the video is in the original. It may be a technological thing. And there you see Mr. Gonsalves come into the intersection, trailed by Officer Endres and Officer McParland driving across Elmwood heading northbound. Can we go to the next slide, please? Now this is the video from civilian number 4. This is the individual who was taking video from a cell phone camera at that intersection. If you could play that, please. And again, what was important to us as we reviewed these videos was that Officer McParland was moving. Next slide, please. So again, we asked ourselves this question: was Mr. Gonsalves boxed in? Well, as I said earlier, for that to happen, for that to have had an impact on this crash, Officer Endres would have needed the help of other officers. Boxing in is one officer driving someone into another. When we interviewed the officers, none of them recalled hearing Officer Endres' radio call. No officer acknowledged that radio call. And the State Police Reconstruction Unit analysis established that McParland entered the intersection before the radio call. And I will tell you that in reaching this conclusion, we listened to the statements of the officers, what they heard or didn't hear, what they said they did or what they didn't do and why. What was critical to me was what the evidence showed, what the physical evidence showed, what the scientific evidence showed, what the video showed. And I believe, based on what that video shows, what the physical evidence shows, is that, as the state police concluded, there is no evidence that Officer McParland attempted to box Mr. Gonsalves in. Whether or not Officer Endres should have made that statement, whether or not that's a violation of department policy, is not pertinent to what we're doing. What we're asking ourselves is, did Officer Endres, or for that matter, did Officer McParland do something that constituted a criminal act? For Officer McParland to have that kind of liability, he would have needed to respond to Officer Endres' request. And we have established and have determined that that did not happen. If we can go to the next slide, please. All right, now this is synchronized video. The colonel alluded to this. This is where the state police took both the civilian number 4 video and the Bissell Street video and lined them up at the same time. So you can see what's happening from 2 different angles at exactly the same time. Now that's really useful, particularly when you do a still shot. It's a little less helpful when you're watching it as it rolls, because you're not sure frankly, which one to look at least that's what I found. But we're going to play it for you anyway, and then we're going to show you some still shots from it. So if we could roll this, please. If you could do that again. Okay. Next slide, please. All right, now these are the still shots. Now these are still shots from the synchronized video taken half a second apart from one another. And these are important to our analysis because they show and establish that Officer McParland is moving. So if you look at where he's located in each one of these still shots that are taken a half second apart, they show that Officer McParland is not in a stationary position, but he's moving. Had Officer McParland been in a stationary position, we might be talking about a very different case, but that's not what this evidence shows. And if we could just show these one after another. This is 2.5 seconds from the sign impact. And you can see particularly here what is useful to me is the picture on the right. You can advance it. And you can advance it again. So just if you would, like if you could just show those 3 still shots one after the other. So 2.5, 2.0, 1.5. All right, next slide. So this is largely, what I'm about to cover next is largely what the colonel has covered. I'll try to move through it quickly, but I think it's important to do it comprehensively. As we know, the crash happened as Mr. Gonsalves attempted to turn right from Elmwood Avenue onto Bissell Street. He went on the sidewalk between the stop sign and the wall of the building at the intersection. Next, please. There we have the stop sign. Next, please. And then here's the Bissell Street video. We're going to roll this again. This will show the entire crash sequence. And again, I'm showing, before you play it, I'm showing you this. I recognize it's difficult to see. I'm showing it to you because I want you to see everything that we reviewed. And then I will show you still shots from the crash, which help explain why we reached the conclusions that we did. So go ahead. Again, this is a camera from Bissell Street. It shows Officer McParland coming in, making his three-point turn. We done?
It's done, yeah.
Next. All right, this is civilian number 4 video. Again, this is the person from their porch on Elmwood Avenue. Go ahead. All right, next. And this is from a fixed surveillance video on Elmwood. That's actually civilian number 4 in the foreground, filming on his cell phone. This is from a fixed surveillance video at the same point in time. Again, I'm showing this to you because I want you to see all of the evidence that we have. Go ahead, please. That's the officer trailing the larger group. There's Officer McParland pulling out. And that's the scene of the crash from the perspective of the Elmwood video. Again, it doesn't show the entire thing. Next slide, please. Now, this is the second half of the video I showed you earlier, where Mr. Gonsalves is circling the cruisers as they first attempt to pull him over. If you could roll this play, please. Doesn't show the crash incredibly well. The audio was muted here because some of the language is such that I didn't feel comfortable putting out over a live stream. But that audio will be available to you, so you'll be able to hear the words of this person. Next slide, please. All right, and this is the synchronized video of the crash. Again, this is Bissell Street, and I believe civilian video number 4. All right, next, please. All right, now these are the still shots. These are very similar to what the colonel went through, so I won't belabor them. Though again, I mean, we've spent a fair amount of time on this case in the last 3 months, and so I want to make sure we cover it for those who haven't quite been as close to it as we have. So this is 2.0 seconds out from the crash. You see that Officer McParland is crossing the center of Elmwood Avenue. Officer Endres is not yet visible, and Mr. Gonsalves is braking as he enters the intersection. That braking, you can see the tail light there, that braking is important because the following distance between Officer Endres and Mr. Gonsalves, which I'll get to in a moment, narrows as Mr. Gonsalves begins to try to make that right-hand turn. And that following distance was important to our analysis. Next. So this is 1.5 seconds out. Again, you can see that Officer McParland has effectively cleared Elmwood Avenue. Again, Mr. Gonsalves is braking as he turns right. Next. We're 1 second out here. When I say 1 second out, we're 1 second out from when the cruiser makes contact with the stop sign. Here you can see from the photographs that both Officer Endres and Mr. Gonsalves are braking. Next. Here are more still shots, 0.5 seconds from the crash. Mr. Gonsalves is up on the sidewalk between the stop sign and the wall. Again, the Colonel showed you these already. Next. We're less than a quarter of a second from the crash. Next. And this is the crash here, where you can see the stop sign in the, and these frames, I believe this is one frame, and then the next frame. I mean, it is literally a split second, not even a second, where you can see the stop sign in the left photograph in a stationary position as Officer Endres strikes it, and then it begins to move in the photograph on the right. Next. This is even another short period of time, later, less than half a second. Next slide, please. And again, this is what I consider to be the critical slide in analyzing how the crash occurred. To me, this is the most conclusive evidence from the videos that show the stop sign being struck, and yet the cruiser having separation from the scooter driven by Mr. Gonsalves. Next. And then this is, of course, the crash itself. Next. So the Colonel went over this, and I won't belabor it. The accident or collision reconstruction unit, and we did not rely just on the video. Again, they lined up damage between the cruiser, the stop sign, and the scooter. They concluded that there was no contact. Again, we mentioned, the Colonel mentioned about looking at the helmet and the stop sign to see exactly how Mr. Gonsalves was injured. Next, please. As the Colonel mentioned, the State Police did a reenactment and ultimately concluded that the accident effectively could not have happened other than what the video and the damage comparison tells us. That for the stop sign to hit Mr. Gonsalves in the head the way that it did, the cruiser must have hit the stop sign as opposed to the scooter itself. Next. All right, this is an important point for our analysis, because again, what we're looking for is, what do we know from this case about Officer Endres' driving in the seconds before the crash? What we know from the black box is that he's slowing. So you can see from this slide that 5 seconds out, he's going 35 miles an hour. He goes up briefly to 35.8 miles per hour. And then his rate of speed rapidly declines over the next 4.5 seconds, down to 18.5 when he strikes the stop sign. That is an obvious indication that he is attempting to slow his vehicle. You know, as opposed to, for example, speeding up to run Mr. Gonsalves off the road, speeding up to close the distance. It shows, in fact, the opposite, that he is braking. Next slide, please. You know, this is the same slide that the Colonel showed you. You know, again, it shows, except for that brief uptick in speed from 35 to 35.8, Officer Endres' speed is coming down. You know, the last two boxes, as the Colonel indicates that the anti-lock brake system has been engaged. I asked the State Police, well, what does that mean in layman's terms? What that means, effectively, is that Officer Endres is hitting his brake as hard as he can. Next. And then this is just a still shot from civilian number 4 video. It confirms what the black box tells us in the video, that Officer Endres was braking as the crash scene approached. Next. Now, this was another important factor in our analysis. You know, we analyzed how close Officer Endres was following Mr. Gonsalves as he traveled down Elmwood Avenue. And you can see here, 2.5 seconds out from the impact with the stop sign, that there's 32 feet of distance. It's around 2 car lengths. Next. At 2 seconds and 1.5 seconds out, 2 on the left, 1.5 on the right, it's 30.8 feet, and it's 18.2 feet. And we'll show the next slide. The distance is closing because they're both braking at this point. If you go back and look at the other slides as to what's happening as Mr. Gonsalves and Officer Endres now is approaching that stop sign, you got to slow to turn. So the distance is closed. But at the critical point for our analysis at 2.5, 2 seconds out, 1.5 seconds out, we're talking about a significant difference between Officer Endres' cruiser and the scooter operated by Mr. Gonsalves. Next. Next. Now, the other thing we looked at, and this is really hard to see, and it's really frankly hard to understand as somebody not steeped in accident reconstruction. And so this is an opinion from the collision reconstruction report. What we asked ourselves was, we know that Officer Endres is braking. We know that he's following from a significant distance behind. What's he doing as he's approaching the crash site? Is he trying to get out of the way? Or is he doing something else? And so we analyzed, and it's in the State Police, I believe it's in the State Police report, which analyzes sort of the degree of turn of the steering wheel as Officer Endres is going into that stop sign crash. The conclusion, though, ultimately is that the way he's turning that wheel is consistent with avoiding a crash, not causing one. So what does that mean? And we'll get to this when we get to the law. That's not to say that Officer Endres drove perfectly here. That's not to say that he didn't misjudge the turn. That's not to say that he didn't make a mistake. What it does say, though, is what he's doing at this point in time. So if we could roll this, please. And it's very short, but if you go back to the State Police report, what they opine is that this movement of the wheel is consistent with trying to avoid a collision, an emergency steering maneuver. So if we go to the next slide, please. All right, now we get to the law. This is really where my office did the analysis. We really analyzed this case most principally in the context of driving to endanger serious bodily injury. And as I said when we started, that requires a showing of criminal recklessness, which is a high standard. High standard, I can just say that, but I'm going to demonstrate to you why, I hope I will, why that's a high standard. The language that the Rhode Supreme Court uses is a heedless indifference to the consequences of your actions to the safety of life and limb. And the Supreme Court says this over and over and over again in the case law. Proof of negligent driving is not enough. Mere inadvertence or error in judgment is not enough. And that's a critical point. And it's a critical point because in all of these cases, and I think back to the boating case on the bay where a sailor was killed 2 summers ago, being driven over by a powerboat. It's a terrible result. And your heart breaks for the family. And yet the criminal justice system does not apply to that situation. It may be a boating moving violation, as it was in that case. It may be a negligence action, and I didn't follow that closely. But what it's not in that case is a reckless action. The Supreme Court has been very, very clear about it, going back as far as 1969. We can go to the next slide, please. You see it here again in this Lund case from 1969. Reckless or recklessly in the penal, that is the criminal statutes, connotes something more than the negligence necessary to support a civil action for damages. Commission of a mere traffic infraction does not, in and of itself, satisfy the threshold for recklessness. Can I have the next one, please? So what's heedless indifference? That's a term of art as much as anything else. So again, we look to the case law for this. And this is a quote from State versus Arnold from 1979. And they talk about evidence such as intoxication, excessive speed, or defective equipment, meaning knowingly defective equipment. I know my brakes aren't working. I drive anyway, and I rear end somebody. We go to the next slide. So what do we look for based on what the Supreme Court has told us? And this happens in every single accident case that we get. Now, I will tell you that the police don't bring us every case where there's an accident or a collision and somebody dies. If you ask my team, they'll tell you that. They bring us a lot of them, though, and this is what we're looking for. And they don't bring them to us because they know it doesn't meet the standard. We're looking for excessive speed, intoxication, impairment, texting, weaving in and out of traffic, passing on the right at a high rate of speed, tailgating, or failure to brake. Frankly, it's the kind of thing that if you're traveling down Route 95, you know it when you see it. You know it when you see it. It's the guy in front of you who's driving like a maniac, or the woman in front of you who's driving like a maniac. Go to the next slide. Now, I got a lot of slides up here about case law, and this is what makes it difficult as a lawyer to try to explain sometimes to press and public how we reach the conclusions that we do. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these cases. You're going to have my slides. It's in our report. What we try to do here, though, is capture what's enough and what isn't enough based on past cases. In this Lund case, the bottom line is the facts in that case is somebody's driving on Ocean Road in Narragansett, misjudges a turn, hits a tree, young woman dies. Supreme Court, negligent, not reckless. Next slide, please. State versus Arnold, another case on 95. A truck driver comes over a ridge, fog, strikes a car that stopped on the roadway ahead of him, kills a 14-year-old girl. Trial judge convicts. No jury, trial judge convicts. Going too fast under all the circumstances, trial judge says. Should have started to take proper action before he did. Supreme Court reverses a conviction. Negligent, not reckless. Next slide. So we contrast State versus Watkins. This is a case from down in South County where the Supreme Court did find reckless. You can see the distinction. The defendant strikes and kills a 6-year-old boy in the Bradford Bridge. He's going 30 miles an hour over the speed limit. He crosses over to the opposite lane of traffic in a no passing zone, has a clear view of everybody in front of him, doesn't brake. Different case. Next case. These are some other cases that I won't go through these in detail. Again, they're in the slides. But again, what we're looking for in these cases, and we're looking for it because it is what the Supreme Court has taught us we need to look for. High rate of speed, failure to brake, intoxication, weaving in and out of traffic, passing on the right. Where we don't have that kind of conduct, we don't have reckless driving. We may have negligence. We may have civil negligence. But this office does not bring civil lawsuits. What this office brings are criminal cases that we need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt where we can establish reckless conduct. So why does this matter? Because when the jury is instructed as to what they must find, what I just said to you is what the jury's going to hear. The jury is going to hear that. And if there's a conviction on appeal to the Supreme Court, we're going to be talking about these very things. And so that's why we look at the law. And I don't put these up there to drown you in legalese. Although I know some of you in the media are taking law classes at Roger Williams. I commend you for that. But that's why we look at the law so closely. Can I have the next slide, please? And the next one. So this is our conclusion, and it's in our report. Basically, given the comparatively low and decreasing speeds involved, the following distance between the vehicles, the unexpected travel, path of travel by Mr. Gonsalves, the extremely short time frame by which Officer Endres had to react, the fact that he was engaging in emergency steering maneuvers, and the fact that he was braking, and at the point of impact, or immediately at point of impact, maximally braking, causes me to conclude that this is not a reckless driving case. Is it a tragic case? Yes. Might it be negligence? Perhaps. But what I cannot prove here, what we cannot prove here, is a reckless driving case. We also analyze the case in the context of intentional conduct. And frankly, there's no evidence to build an even more challenging case that Officer Endres intended to cause harm here. The evidence just does not support that. And I will tell you, as I said in the beginning, that these conclusions are based. I didn't put anybody's witness statement up here. I put the scientific evidence up here. I put the video evidence up here because that is what this conclusion is based on. When you review the civilian witness statements and when you review the officer statements, they conflict. They're not consistent. You'll see it. We saw it. And so I went back to where I knew I had the truth. When no one, and I'm not saying anybody deliberately told us a falsehood, this happened really fast. You see that video. Can anyone from the live video really figure out even whether or not the cruiser hit the scooter? It's only until you break it down that you can see that. And I credit the State Police team for being able to do that and allow us to be able to do that. That's what we based our conclusions on. So, where do we go from here? What we didn't find, as I said, was whether or not there was civil negligence here. I don't want to characterize this statement beyond this. You have Officer Endres' statement. Take it for whatever value you will. He acknowledges he misjudged that turn. But misjudging that turn does not make him criminally reckless. And it would not be responsible of me to bring a charge based on that. What Providence police choose to do with respect to their internal policies, or the performance of their officers, or moving violations, is a matter for them, but not for me. That is not what this office does. We analyze conduct for criminal misconduct, and that's what we've done here to the best of our ability. So I thank you and the public for your patience. And I want to particularly thank the family for their patience. This was hard news to deliver today. And as I said, I've met with them a number of times. It is hard to see these videos again. We walked it through with them again as we did with you. It's hard for them to see it, and I understand that. And I am grateful for their patience with me. They heard me out this morning, and I'm grateful to them for that. So let me stop there, and I'll take any questions.